All right, so today we're diving into something pretty massive. Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness,
Oh, yeah.
a real cornerstone of existentialism,
Mm.
published in 1943. And it just throws you right into these deep questions about consciousness, like how we see the world, our relationships with others, even nothingness itself. And what's fascinating is that this whole philosophical journey, well, it really started with Sartre, right, grappling with the ideas of Heidegger.
Definitely. Sartre was actually a prisoner of war when he first encountered Heidegger's Being and Time, and it was a turning point for him, shaping his own philosophical path.
Okay.
But while Heidegger definitely influenced him, Sartre had his own unique perspective, his own vision. See, Heidegger saw potential for humans to find a kind of fulfillment, a sense of belonging in the world by reconnecting with what he called being. But Sartre's views, well, it's a bit more stark, more pessimistic, maybe. He focuses on this deep human desire for complete self-sufficiency, this longing to be what he called ens causa sui. It's like, imagine wanting to be a self-created being, something akin to the traditional idea of God.
So this intense desire to be complete, self-sufficient, almost godlike in a way.
Yeah.
But the catch, and Sartre definitely points this out, is that we're also deeply rooted in the material world. We're born into bodies. We exist in this physical universe. It's a tension. This conflict leads to one of his most radical ideas. Existence precedes essence. He flips the script on thinkers like Descartes, who famously said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am.
Right.
But for Sartre, it's not our thoughts that come first and define us. It's our actions, the choices we make in the world. We are, in essence, what we do.
Exactly. And this radical idea, it's deeply tied to the influence of Husserl and his phenomenology. Husserl's key insight was that consciousness is always intentional, always directed towards something. It's always consciousness of something. Sartre takes this idea and pushes it even further, arguing against the existence of, like, a hidden self within consciousness, like some separate entity that observes everything. If there was such a thing, then we'd have to be conscious of that self too, leading to an infinite loop. So the self, that core sense of who we are, it's not a pre-existing thing, fixed and unchanging. It's constantly being shaped and created through our choices and actions in the world.
So today what we want to do is try to unpack some of the most important ideas from being and nothingness and give you, the listener, a solid understanding of these concepts, which, let's be honest, can be pretty complex.
Yeah.
It's like a philosophical shortcut, a crash course in existentialism. So where do we even begin this exploration?
A good place to start, I think, is with Sartre's unique perspective on the origin of negation, the concept of nothingness.
Nothingness. It sounds so, I don't know, abstract, right?
Right.
But Sartre insists it's not just some intellectual game. It's a real part of our everyday experience.
That's right.
And he uses these really down-to-earth examples like the absence of a friend or not having enough money. Can you expand on that a bit?
Sure. What's really interesting here is that Sartre takes this concept of nothingness, which seems so empty, and shows us its very real impact. Let's say your friend Pierre is usually at his spot in the cafe, but today he's not there. That empty chair, it's not just a neutral blank space, it actually changes the whole atmosphere for you. And in the same way, not having enough money isn't just a neutral state of lack. It directly restricts what you can do, how you experience the world. It modifies the totality of your experience. It's like how a blind person's life is shaped by their inability to see. Sartre calls this concrete nothingness, and it's different from, say, thinking about a square circle. That's abstract nothingness, something that can't exist in reality.
So it's not just about what's missing, but about how that absence actively changes what's present.
Right.
And then he connects this idea to our human capacity to ask questions.
Absolutely. The simple act of asking a question opens up the possibility of a negative response.
Right.
Imagine, who's knocking at the door? No one. Just like that, nothingness enters our world. For Sartre, it's consciousness, what he calls being for itself, that is the source of this negation. Our fundamental relationship with the world, with what he calls being in itself, that's just the sheer existence of things. It's a relationship built on questioning. Now, when consciousness asks a question, it doesn't destroy the being of things, but it does change our relationship with them. It highlights what isn't there just as much as what is. It's like we're constantly probing, exploring, looking for those gaps, those absences in the fabric of reality.
That's a very different way of looking at it. Now, another concept being in nothingness is known for is bad faith. The French term is mauvaise foi. It might sound like simple lying, but Sartre's take on it is, well, it's much deeper, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's more about how we deceive ourselves, how we relate to our own human reality.
Yep.
Sartre identifies two main forms of bad faith. The first is believing you are not what you are.
Okay.
And the second, which can be even more damaging, is the tendency to see yourself as a fixed object, as a thing, rather than a being with freedom and potential.
And he uses that very vivid example of the waiter in the cafe. You know, the one meticulously acting out the role of a waiter. Can you walk us through that?
Of course. Sartre describes the waiter's movements as, well, almost too perfect. Everything is exaggerated, rehearsed, like he's putting on a show. He's overly eager to please the customer. His voice, his gestures, everything is carefully calculated. Sartre even says, all his behavior seems to us a game.
Like a performance.
Exactly. The waiter is playing at being a waiter. And the bad faith lies in his belief that this social role, this job title, defines his whole existence.
Right.
He's trapped in this role, and it prevents him from seeing his own freedom, his potential to be more than just the waiter. It's as if he's trying to become a fixed entity, an object defined by his job.
So it's about getting stuck in a social role, a script, and mistaking the performance for the whole person.
Right.
And Sartre says that our awareness of nothingness is actually the key to breaking free from this trap. He talks about the self entering the great human flux.
Yes.
What exactly does that mean?
This is where it gets really interesting. Sartre sees this recognition of nothingness as a liberating thing. It's the realization that we're not permanently defined by our current situation, by our past choices, by our job titles. There's always the potential to become something else. This great human flux is this constant possibility of change, of transcending limitations, even our own self-conceptions. It's the understanding that we're always in the process of becoming, never a finished product.
I see. He also uses the example of someone denying their homosexuality to illustrate bad faith. How does that fit into this idea?
Well, Sartre argues that in that case, the person's trying to force themselves into a rigid category, a socially acceptable box. It's like trying to say that a table is simply and absolutely just a table with no other possibilities. While Sartre acknowledges that there is an irreducible character of human reality, meaning we can't be completely labeled or reduced to a single characteristic, bad faith comes in when we refuse to acknowledge parts of our experience, our feelings, our desires.
Right.
It's this tension between accepting what is true about ourselves and also recognizing the fluid, open nature of human existence. Sartre makes this crucial point. I am never any of my attitudes, any of my actions. We are always more than the sum of our behaviors and self-definitions.
But then he throws in this seemingly paradoxical idea that to achieve authentic existence, there needs to be a bit of good faith within bad faith. How can self-deception contain the seed of its own undoing?
It's a subtle point, but an important one. Sartre suggests that to move beyond bad faith, to become authentic, there has to be at least a tiny bit of awareness that the role you're playing, the identity you're clinging to, is actually a form of self-deception. It's like a little voice whispering, hey, this isn't really you.
Okay.
This awareness, this good faith within the bad faith, allows for the possibility of choosing to live differently, more aligned with your true self, projecting a future self that isn't dictated by external pressures or those ingrained patterns of bad faith.
I see. And this has implications for traditional ethics, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Sartre sees traditional ethical systems as often relying on a denial of freedom, a submission to external authority. It's like being told what to do, how to behave, without questioning it. He sees this as a potential form of bad faith, a way for societies to control individuals by encouraging them to suppress their own desires and responsibilities. Even seeing your life as just a fixed set of past events, something unchanging, that's a form of bad faith too, because it denies the ongoing dynamic nature of your present self and your capacity to make choices right now.
Wow.
All right.
Okay, we've talked about how we deceive ourselves. Now let's move to how we see ourselves in relation to others.
Yeah.
Let's talk about being for others and this powerful idea of the look.
Right. The look is central to Sartre's social philosophy. It's this idea that even the possibility of another person being present changes how we experience ourselves and the world around us. We become aware of ourselves as objects, how we might appear in the eyes of that other person. It's not just about physically seeing someone, it's more about a pervasive awareness of a subjectivity outside of our own.
He uses that kind of unsettling story about mistaking a mannequin for a real person.
Oh, yeah.
It's always stuck with me.
It's a great example. Think about it. When you think a mannequin is a real person, just for a moment, your whole world changes. Suddenly, objects around you seem to have a life of their own, like they belong to this person you think you see. And you lose that feeling of being the center of your own universe.
Right.
The world, even just for that brief moment, becomes partly their world.
And then you realize it's just a mannequin, and that feeling of being watched vanishes. You're back to being at the center of your own experience. But Sartre says that this awareness of potentially being seen, it's constant, unavoidable.
Yes, it is. Even when we're physically alone, we carry this internalized look of society, of the generalized other, all those norms and expectations we've absorbed. It's like an invisible audience that's always with us. We're aware on some level of how we might appear to others, and that awareness shapes our thoughts and feelings about ourselves.
So this has a huge impact on our relationships, right? He says that sometimes our attraction to someone isn't really about them, but about how their look, their gaze, makes us feel about ourselves.
It's like seeking validation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that doesn't sound like a very solid foundation for a relationship.
It's not. Sartre argues that relationships based on trying to control the other person's gaze to secure your own sense of self are inherently unstable and prone to conflict. Each person is trying to manipulate the other to maintain a certain image. He even suggests that a lot of conflictual relationships, often romanticized as love, are actually a form of bad faith playing out on a relational level. Instead of being our authentic selves, our being for itself, we become obsessed with how we appear in the eyes of the other. The relationship becomes all about maintaining that gaze, even if it means sacrificing genuine connection.
And he connects this idea of the look to sexual desire.
Oh, yeah.
That's a pretty bold move, stepping away from purely biological explanations.
What's interesting is his concept of reciprocal incarnation. He sees it as a key part of sexual experience. It's a mutual desire, a longing to experience and be experienced by the other person as both body and consciousness. It's about recognizing each other's subjectivity, but in a very intimate way. But even in this deeply personal act, Sartre sees a struggle, this yearning for a complete union between consciousness and body, a harmony that he believes is ultimately unattainable. It's a reflection of that larger human desire to be ens causa sui, that impossible yearning for complete self-sufficiency.
Now, let's move on to Sartre's perspective on Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. He wasn't exactly a fan of the whole unconscious mind thing, was he?
Not quite.
Why was that?
Sartre's main disagreement with Freud stems from his fundamental belief that consciousness is, by its very nature, self-aware.
Okay.
He argues that Freud's idea of the unconscious, as a way to explain why people seem to know and not know things at the same time, particularly traumatic experiences, well, it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
So you're talking about the sensor?
Yeah. Yes. That internal mechanism Freud proposed, the one that supposedly represses these painful memories.
Right.
Sartre points out that for the sensor to be effective, it has to be aware of what it's repressing. Even if it's operating unconsciously, that awareness implies a kind of self-deception or bad faith happening at the level of the sensor itself. So instead of resolving the paradox of knowing and not knowing, Freud's theory just pushes it to a different level.
So Sartre sees the unconscious as an unnecessary explanation.
Right. He believes that what Freud calls repression is actually just bad faith. It's not a separate mechanism, it's just consciousness deceiving itself. He calls Freud's theory a lie without a liar because it introduces this unconscious entity that's doing the deceiving, but without explaining how.
Now, this has been a lot of information.
Yeah.
For our listeners who are new to Sartre, maybe we can go over some key terms so they can keep everything straight. It can feel like learning a whole new language.
Of course. So being, or être, is just the general term for objective reality, everything that exists, both conscious and non-conscious.
Okay.
Then we have being in itself, or être en soi, which is non-conscious being.
Right.
Think of things like a rock or a chair. It's solid, complete in itself, and we can never fully grasp it with our minds.
Right.
In contrast, being for itself, or être pour soi, is conscious being, human consciousness.
Okay.
It's defined by its lack of inherent being, a desire for being, which we talked about earlier as the ens causa sui aspiration, and its ability to introduce nothingness into the world through questioning, negation, and freedom of choice.
Oh, yeah.
And being for others, or être pour autrui, is how we exist as objects in the eyes of other people. It's shaped by that look we discussed.
Right. And how does Sartre define consciousness itself?
For Sartre, consciousness is the transcendent being for itself.
Okay.
That's not a thing, but a process defined by its relationship with being, with what's other than itself.
So it's always in relation to something.
Exactly. And existence, that refers to our concrete being in the world right now, in this moment. It's the raw facticity of our being.
Okay.
Then there's existence precedes essence, that core principle.
Right.
It means we define our nature through our choices, not the other way around.
It's not predetermined.
Exactly. Facticity, or facticite, refers to the facts about our existence that we didn't choose. Where we were born, our past, our bodies, it's what connects being for itself to being in itself, to the world and our own history.
Okay.
But freedom, that's not something we have, it's what we are as being for itself. Sartre says we're condemned to be free. We're always making choices, defining ourselves, even in the face of those facts we can't change. Nothingness now isn't a thing itself, it's what being for itself brings into the world through questioning and negation. Finally, there's a difference between reflect, which is like a reflection in a mirror. It's how being for itself reflects its own nothingness, and reflection, which is reflective consciousness. That's when consciousness tries to study itself, which can be tricky and misleading.
Okay.
So those are some of the key terms to keep in mind.
Now, being and nothingness, it's a monumental work,
Yes.
but it's had its share of critics.
Yeah.
What was the general reaction to it? What were some of the main points of contention?
It's definitely a book that sparked a lot of debate.
Right.
Even during Sartre's lifetime, other existentialist thinkers, like Gabriel Marcel, acknowledged its importance.
Okay.
He was particularly impressed with Sartre's analysis of bad faith.
Right.
And later, Susan Sontag, she really appreciated Sartre's discussions about the body and relationships. His work is also seen as groundbreaking for starting a phenomenological exploration of sexuality, which has influenced many philosophical discussions in that area.
But some of the more abstract ideas, like nothingness, and his emphasis on absolute free will, those were more controversial, right?
Yes, absolutely. Some philosophers, like Jean-Paul, they had issues with Sartre's understanding of nothingness.
Okay.
Frederick Copleston, in his History of Philosophy, he found Sartre's claim that all human actions stem from radical free will to be, well, a bit too much. Though he did admire Sartre's attempts to defend that position.
Right.
A.J. Ayer, the logical positivist, he dismissed a lot of the book as just confusing metaphysics, and misuse of language. And regarding the critique of Freud, like we talked about, some thinkers, like David Pears and Thomas Baldwin, argued that Sartre misunderstood Freud.
Okay.
Baldwin even suggests that Sartre's own attempts to incorporate some Freudian ideas were more insightful than his criticisms.
Interesting.
Iris Murdoch, she drew a parallel between being and nothingness in Gilbert Ryle's work, suggesting a surprising connection to analytic philosophy. Some later critics, like Naomi Green, they argued that Sartre's work has an anti-sexual bias, and Andreas Michels has explored how Sartre's focus on consciousness might neglect the role of the body in shaping our experiences. So it's a book that still generates a lot of discussion.
A lot to unpack, definitely. Let's bring this back to bad faith and use that example of the woman on a first date to illustrate it. It helps to see these abstract ideas play out in real-life situations.
That's a great example Sartre uses. So picture this. A woman is on a first date.
Okay.
She's aware of the unspoken possibilities, the attraction, the potential for intimacy.
Right.
Even a casual touch can feel charged. But maybe she's not ready to confront those desires, to move beyond just being friends.
Okay.
So she engages in bad faith. She focuses only on superficial things, pretends she's only interested in intellectual topics, downplays any hint of attraction.
She's trying to control the narrative.
Exactly. She's jumping back and forth between seeing herself as pure possibility, a being with limitless potential, and as just a fixed object defined by this role of friend on this date.
Right.
This denial of her present desires, it's a classic example of bad faith in action.
So she's aware of what's happening, but chooses to ignore it, to lie to herself.
Right. Sartre argues that the self-deception is at the heart of bad faith. The deceiver and the deceived are the same person. And consciousness is always intentional, always aware of itself and its relationship to the world. It's what Sartre calls the translucency of consciousness.
Okay.
Even in self-deception, there's a level of understanding, a knowing of what's being hidden.
Interesting.
And it's this internal negation, this way consciousness turns against itself, that makes bad faith so unique. We don't just find negativity in the world, we can also direct it inward, towards ourselves.
This tendency towards bad faith, it often comes from our fear of freedom, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
The idea that we're constantly making choices that define us, that can be overwhelming.
it can be terrifying. So bad faith becomes a way to escape that responsibility, that anxiety. We blame fate, God, social pressures, anything but ourselves. We say, it wasn't my choice, I couldn't help it.
Right.
But the irony is, even that attempt to escape freedom is a choice. It's an exercise of the very freedom we're trying to deny.
Ah, I see. And this goes back to his critique of psychoanalysis.
Yes.
He saw it as another way of avoiding that responsibility by introducing this idea of a hidden, unconscious world controlling our behavior.
Exactly.
A lie without a liar.
Precisely. By saying that the unconscious is calling the shots, psychoanalysis removes the responsibility from conscious choice. It makes the self external to itself. Sartre argues that this contradicts his idea that consciousness is consciousness of being conscious.
Okay.
By dividing the psyche into the id, ego, and superego, psychoanalysis creates a kind of opacity that undermines that inherent unity and transparency of consciousness.
Now, what about the alternative to bad faith? Sartre mentioned sincerity, but it seems like he has problems with that concept too.
He does. Sincerity, on the surface, seems like the opposite of bad faith. It's about being true to yourself, right?
Yeah.
But Sartre points out a paradox.
Okay.
To be exactly what you are would make you, like being in itself, a fixed thing. But humans, as being for itself, were characterized by a lack of a fixed essence.
We're constantly changing.
Yes. So, ironically, sincerity requires effort. It requires us to actively make ourselves be what we are. He uses the waiter example again. Even when the waiter is sincerely playing the role, there's still a difference between truly being a waiter, like a table is a table, and consciously choosing to act like one.
I see.
True sincerity, for a human who's always changing, it's a difficult, maybe even impossible ideal.
To really bring these concepts to life, let's talk about Sartre's novel, The Age of Reason, the first book in his Roads to Freedom trilogy. How does this novel explore bad faith?
The Age of Reason is a fantastic example of these themes playing out in a story.
Okay.
The main character is Mathieu Delarue, a philosophy professor in his late 30s. He's dealing with his girlfriend's unplanned pregnancy and his own unwillingness to commit to anything. He's holding on to this idea of youthful freedom while living a pretty conventional life.
And his bad faith is reflected in his relationships with the other characters, right?
Absolutely. There's Marcel, his girlfriend. She's insecure, wants commitment. Then there's Boris, his student, who admires him, which Mathieu kind of manipulates.
Okay.
And Daniel, who's this cynical, wealthy guy. His motivations are always a bit unclear.
Right.
Sartre brilliantly switches between their perspectives, showing their inner struggles with freedom, responsibility, and bad faith. For example, Mathieu tries to get money for Marcel's abortion, but doesn't want to be emotionally involved. He wants to be seen as this free spirit while actually living a comfortable but unfulfilling life.
There's that confrontation with his brother, Jacques, that really stands out.
Yes, that's a key moment. Jacques accuses Mathieu of living in bad faith.
How so?
He points out that Mathieu enjoys the benefits of bourgeois society while pretending to reject it. And he avoids responsibility for Marcel by hiding behind intellectual ideas.
Right.
Jacques tells him to grow up, to face reality, and accept his bourgeois existence instead of clinging to this outdated idea of freedom.
So Mathieu's using this abstract idea of freedom to avoid real responsibility.
Exactly. He wants this grand, undefined freedom, but ends up making impulsive, meaningless choices, which makes him feel even more inauthentic.
Right.
Even his relationship with Brunet, a communist activist, highlights this. Mathieu admires Brunet's commitment, but can't bring himself to follow the same path. He's stuck. And Daniel, he represents a different kind of freedom, more spontaneous, less burdened by anxieties.
Right.
But his actions are often motivated by a desire to shock rather than genuine authenticity.
Okay.
His decision to marry Marcel, considering his homosexuality and cynicism, it's complex, but it could be seen as a step towards sincerity, towards taking responsibility.
Interesting.
And by the end of the book, Mathieu has this realization, his entry into the Age of Reason. He finally starts to confront his situation, to accept the weight of his freedom and the responsibility that comes with it.
So it's not a complete transformation.
Not quite, but it's a start. He's realizing that freedom isn't just an idea, it's something you live with consequences.
That's a powerful way to illustrate these ideas. So we've taken a pretty deep dive into being and nothingness today.
We have.
We talked about nothingness, about bad faith, about the look, and Sartre's critique of psychoanalysis.
Yes, it's been a wide-ranging discussion.
And at the heart of it all is that idea, existence precedes essence. It's our choices, our actions, how we engage with the world that make us who we are.
And that leads us to a final thought for you, the listener. As you go about your day, think about the moments where you might be operating in bad faith. Are you clinging to a past self or an idealized future to avoid the responsibility of your present freedom? How can becoming aware of your consciousness, of its capacity for both freedom and self-deception, help you live a more authentic life? This exploration, inspired by Sartre's work, is really just the beginning of understanding what it means to be human.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into being and nothingness.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, keep questioning, keep exploring, and until next time, keep diving deep.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.